Alright guys, so let's talk about Europe today because big things are happening. Now we all know that Trump and Putin just concluded a call and all roads are leading towards peace, which is a good thing. Trump is moving towards ending the war and negotiating a big peace settlement with Russia. And this will affect everyone around the world, especially the EU, the Eurozone.
I think realism is an important part of the conversation that hasn't existed enough inside conversations amongst friends. But simply pointing out realism, like the borders won't be rolled back to what everybody would like them to be in 2014, is not a concession to Vladimir Putin. It's a recognition of hard power realities on the ground after a lot of investment and sacrifice, first by the Ukrainians and then by allies, and then a realization that a negotiated peace is going to be some sort of demarcation that neither side.
So we have all listened to what the new defense secretary said at the NATO defense meeting. He basically destroyed the hopes of the EU, that the US, that the Americans will stay there forever and help them with Project Ukraine. And understand what the EU has gone through from 2022 until today. They have followed American orders on literally everything. We all remember the sanctions on Russia disengaging from cheap Russian energy and, of course, confiscating the assets. And now the US is willing to enter serious negotiations with the Russians. This is going to freak out the Eurozone. And this means the US is basically saying that the Western alliance as a whole, especially the Europeans, has lost and it's time to leave the poker table. It's time to disengage and realize that the US, unlike Europe, has the ability to. The United States is an ocean away from the Eurozone, from continental Europe. So whatever happens over there seriously doesn't really affect them to a large degree. The US has all the leverage here. They have the bigger economy, they have the big tariff stick, the energy supply, and the US dollar system. So if things really come to a head, they could always arm twist the EU into full compliance. Now this is very, very bad for the Eurozone. Over the last 2 to 3 years, they have essentially lost three things. They have lost their autonomy, they have lost their economy, and they have lost prestige. And all these three are very important on the world stage. The US holds all the cards because of the defense structure in both NATO and the level of aid the US has given Ukraine. If we do our calculations, we can see that the US has given them at least 120 to 150 billion dollars, and that's on par with all the countries in the EU combined together. So if the EU really wants to defend Ukraine themselves, they will have to do an incredible, a titanic military buildup. And can they really afford it? Now this would mean spending an additional $3.1 trillion to expand their own militaries and arm Ukraine. In addition to that, Ukraine also faces a funding gap for their reconstruction. And guess how much that shortfall is going to be? $130 billion. And if the US abandons the EU, which they likely would, they want to reserve all the money for themselves, who is going to fund the black hole? It's important we realize that the EU is much more constrained in their debt and fiscal spending than the US. The US has the power of the dollar, so they can endlessly borrow money, and worst comes to worst, they can just print it with very few inflation, disastrous effects, at least in the short term. The Eurozone is very different. They will have to blow out the debt brakes and commit to spending a lot. Now just take Macron in France for example, just recently. He wants the EU to spend more than 3% a year in deficit. He knows that the Eurozone has to crank up the deficit spending machine because there's no way to rebuild your economy, potentially rebuild Ukraine, and continuously guard against the Russians while building up your own military at just 3% a year deficit. So going forward, we can kind of expect the Europeans, the EU, to crank up deficit spending, maybe the Eurozone as a whole 5 to 6% on par with the US. But there's a problem. Now the world is afraid of Western bonds, especially the global south, the global majority. So raising money will be quite hard. Now by following the US in asset confiscation, trying to sell bonds won't be as easy as the past anymore. Yields will have to go up. And it kind of gets worse for the EU. Now, during a press conference in the Oval Office, Trump basically told the world that, hey, why not get Russia back in the G7 or the G8?
Have Russia back to the G7, sir?
I'd love to have them back. I think it was a mistake to throw them out. Look, it's not a question of liking Russia or not liking Russia. It was the G8. And I said, what are you doing? You guys, all you talk about is Russia, and they should be sitting at the table. I think Putin would love to be back. Obama and a couple of other people made a mistake and they got Russia out. It's very possible that if that was the G8, you wouldn't have had the problem with Ukraine. And if I was president, you definitely wouldn't have had the problem with Ukraine. Russia would have never attacked Ukraine. But you ask a very good question, the G8. It used to be the G8, and then these people threw them out. And I was arguing with Trudeau and with numerous of the people. Actually, Prime Minister Abe, a great man from Japan, agreed with me 100%, and some of the others did too. But I got there, it was the G7, as you know. They had already been terminated. I think it would have been very helpful, and it still would be helpful to have Russia be a part of that mix.
Now, the Kremlin has said that the G7 has lost a lot of relevance because the future is obviously in BRICS. And just look at what the G7 has morphed into during Biden's term. It's basically turned into the Western club of sanctions and economic punishments on everyone except the Western world. And I think it's really irrelevant if Russia joins or not. But for the EU, they will see it as the ultimate betrayal from Trump. Trump's big agenda for Russia is basically to resume trade with Putin and drive a wedge between China and the Russian economy. Understand that the US needs a lot of raw materials, and a lot of the supply chains are controlled by China. And Russia is a commodity giant. A lot of their own commodities flows to China as well. China has imposed a lot of restrictions, a lot of critical bans that the Russians can potentially elevate. But will Putin do it? Because they have survived without the G7 economies, without their trade, and even without the dollar system. Trade with China and BRICS saw their GDP grow tremendously, over 3 or even 4% this year. And going forward, Russia's economy is going to grow by 2 to 3% as well for the next 3 to 4 years. So is re-engagement with the US on Trump's terms really necessary? For Europe, this is going to be horrifying because all the benefits will be reaped by the US. The EU can't go back to cheap Russian gas anymore. And it's really important we understand why. If they do go re-engage back with the Russians for cheap energy, like the Germans turning back on Nord Stream 2, that pipeline, it calls into question the entire past 3 to 4 years. It tells the world that they were wrong. They were wrong to either engage an economic war with Russia in that manner, or they were wrong in following the Americans. Now, winter is coming cold for the EU, and their gas prices, they have reached a 2-year high. It's looking extremely horrible for the EU. Now, their economies are moving further and further towards deindustrialization. And this is where the US just slapped the EU across the face again. It's really horrible. At the Munich Security Conference, JD Vance clobbered the EU on many topics, but the most painful was their deindustrialization.
You win wars with weapons, and the West doesn't make enough weapons. Now, I don't mean to beat up on Germany here because I love Germany, but I wanted to respond to something Ms. Lang said earlier. Look, Germany is the one country, maybe, in NATO that did not follow the stupid Washington consensus and allow their country to be deindustrialized during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And yet at the very moment that Putin is more and more powerful, where the Russian army is invading European countries en masse, this is the point at which Germany starts to deindustrialize. Look at the number of people working in manufacturing in Germany now versus 10 years ago. Look at the critical raw materials produced in Germany now versus 10 years ago. The energy dependence now versus 10 or 20 years ago. We have got to stop deindustrializing. We want Europe to be successful, but Europe has got to take a bigger role in its own security. You can't do that.
Now, this is very ironic. It's so fateful at the same time. Germany in the 80s and the 90s did indeed follow their own tune and they built their own industries. But in 2022, they followed Biden's orders into deindustrialization. German and EU industries are in a big crisis. They are in shambles. Not only are industrial costs extremely high, their energy advantage has flowed to China, and the US is now tariffing them. It's going to be very impossible for them to compete. Let's not forget that Trump, well, he said publicly that he wants $500 billion in rare earths or minerals from Ukraine. And Zelensky also said he's keen to do the deal. So we could see the EU losing a lot of leverage here. If the US leaves, they have a $3 trillion bill, and if they stay, resources will be cornered by the US. Either way, the EU loses. Now, we have seen the headlines that Trump wants China, Russia, and the US itself to cut defense spending by half. Now, why is that? Because the debt burden in the US is just so high. But defense spending is a very serious business for the US. Remember, the military industrial complex. This is what Eisenhower has been warning the world about. Where is the shortfall going to come from? Well, selling weapons to the EU, of course. If the US leaves and the EU needs to handle their own defense, they will need US hardware. The EU defense base is kaput, so they are captive customers to the United States, which is quite brilliant actually if you're looking at US foreign policy. Everything under Trump has to be seen under an America First lens. Even this move to exit the EU, to exit the Russian theater of war, is helping to reindustrialize the US at the expense of the Eurozone. So putting things simply, Trump has the EU where he wants them, because if they don't comply, the US could simply close off their consumer markets to EU exports. They have been doing this over the last 1 to 2 months with all their tariff threats. 20% of EU exports goes into the US, and why is that? Why is the EU so bent on selling things to the United States? Because this is a tariff market that is cut away from cheap Chinese goods. So it is necessary for the EU to sell into the US. But what does this mean for the Eurozone? The EU is going to get further deindustrialized, while the US comes out of this the biggest winner. Now, the gains the US gets in terms of a captive customer for defense and energy and rare earths, this really helps build out their manufacturing supply chains. This is a very big win for the US. Let's not underestimate this. China and the US, well, they're going to come out of this as the big lottery winners. The US, they're going to leech a lot of industrial capacity, brain power, intellect, as well as industries from the Eurozone. China is rather straightforward, right? They get to de-dollarize the world further and they get cheap Russian commodities like oil and gas. Unfortunately, the EU has no choice but to take the punishments. They didn't think far ahead, and admitting they are wrong today is still politically impossible.